On April 5, 1941, around 8 p.m., Missouri resident Reverend William Huffman answered a telephone call that would change his life forever. That day, Reverend Huffman was informed there was a crash nearby, and authorities asked him to come along in case anyone needed last rites administered. Soon a car was sent to pick up Reverend Huffman, and he was driven to the scene. As Huffman rode along, he believed this was an airplane crash. However, as he arrived, it was not at all what he expected. In this episode, we will cover this interesting UFO crash case, one that occurred 6 years before Roswell and became to be known as the Cape Girardeau UFO Crash. As Reverend Huffman pulled up to the crash site around 10 miles outside the town of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, he would be shocked to see a variety of individuals at the scene. There were firemen, policemen, FBI agents, as well as some locals. The military was there as well. Reverend Huffman would get out of the car, and as he looked around the site for the crashed plane, he would be shocked to see something else in the wreckage. It was a silver disc-shaped craft that had broken in half. It looked like nothing the Reverend had ever seen before. The craft was composed of some type of shiny silver metal. Scattered around the wreckage, there were some small seats and strange electronic devices. Reverend Huffman was able to look inside the wall of the wrecked craft and noted it had strange writing, similar to Egyptian hieroglyphics. After this, military authorities guided him toward 3 beings, all extraterrestrials. They had been thrown outside the craft once it crashed. According to the story, 2 were deceased, while 1 was close to dying. The beings looked like typical gray aliens. They were small, around 4 feet tall, with a slender frame. They had large eyes, a large head, and a small nose and mouth. Their arms were abnormally long compared to the rest of their bodies. While grays are often reported to have pretty long arms, in this case they were said to be extremely long. After Reverend Huffman performed the last rites, he was pulled aside by military authorities and was sworn to secrecy. At this time, the military had taken full control of the scene, and many other authorities, such as police and firemen, appeared to be getting kicked out. The Reverend was then driven home and reminded once again to keep the matter private. Reverend Huffman was too shaken, though, by what he had seen and felt obliged to tell his family. That night, the Reverend sat down at the kitchen table and recalled his experience to his wife Floyd and his sons. The family would keep the story a secret for decades. Then in 1991, Charlotte Mann reached out to UFO investigator Leo Stringfield. Charlotte is the granddaughter of Reverend Huffman. In speaking with Stringfield, and also in later interviews, Charlotte recalled her father having a photo of the event. She said she saw it growing up and recalled it was a picture of a little alien being held up under the armpits by 2 men on each side. Charlotte recalls that what stood out to her in the photo was the being's arms were so long and also the eyes. Interestingly, the 2 men holding up the being were non-military men wearing white shirts and brown pants. Charlotte says the men arrived before the military came and the locals snapped the photo. According to Charlotte, a few weeks after the incident, one of the locals dropped off the photo to Reverend Huffman as the military had been going around threatening everyone. It is believed the photo was taken by local resident Garland D. Frauenberger. In the early 1980s, Charlotte's grandmother, Floyd Huffman, became ill with cancer. Charlotte recalls wanting to find out the truth around the event before she died. She had seen the photo growing up, but was young and didn't really know what to make of it. She also heard the story in bits and pieces, but never the full thing. Floyd was hesitant at first, but eventually relayed the entire story to Charlotte. While this case has some solid aspects, there's certainly some characteristics that will lead many to doubt the story. First off, it appears there is only one witness, Charlotte Mann, who seems to be able to recall this story. While it's not unusual for a family secret like this to come out decades later, it is somewhat unusual that no other witnesses to the event can be located, especially in what seems like an event that would have the whole town talking. James Westwood, a UFO researcher, traveled to Cape Girardeau hoping to find records or sources of people who remembered the event. However, by all accounts, Westwood came up pretty empty and was unable to find a second source for the story. To make matters worse, UFO researcher Leo Stringfield, who investigated the case and broke it, died in 1994. It doesn't appear his family has released the records on the case. Even if they did, it seems that Stringfield based his report just on Charlotte Mann's account. That said, this story really comes down to one witness, and one witness only, who didn't actually experience the event firsthand. That makes it tough to find this event credible, in our opinion. That said, it is of course very possible that this did happen. In addition, it could be the case that another source exists, and we just couldn't find it. Many of the characteristics of the beings, appearing like typical greys, and the craft, is what is reported all too often by UFO witnesses. If this event did happen, then somewhere there should be a case file, or more info on this. The UFO would likely have been taken somewhere along with the alien corpses. In time, let's hope we find another source and more information on this case. During the 1950s, UFO sightings and alien encounters were prevalent around the world. While the United States appeared to be the epicenter of activity, Europe had a large number of unexplained UFO sightings. In particular, Italy experienced a number of incredible sightings, some of which we have covered on prior episodes on this channel, like the Sanina case, or the 1954 football game in which thousands spotted a UFO over the stadium. In this episode, we will cover a UFO sighting, an alien encounter that occurred just prior to the 1954 football game. It is said to be one of the better known alien encounters in Italy. In time, this case became to be known as the 1950 Varese incident. On the evening of April 24, 1950, Bruno Ficini, a mechanic, was working the late shift in his local factory during a violent thunderstorm. Bruno was 40 years old at the time and married with a young son. He lived right next to the factory, which was located in Varese, about 50 miles from the city of Milan. Around 10 p.m., once the rain and lightning stopped, Bruno stepped outside to have a cigarette. As he relaxed, he would soon see a strange light flashing in a field across the way. Bruno was somewhat concerned as the lights were where a high-voltage power line was. He believed the line, which supplied power to much of the town, may have been knocked down. He was concerned that a downed power line could be extremely dangerous, since children like his often played in the area. After not seeing the light for a few moments, he decided to head back. Just as he was turning around, he noticed the flashing lights once again. Bruno decided to walk to get closer and see what it was. As he got up closer, Bruno would see something next to the power line. It was some sort of craft, around 30 feet wide and 10 feet across. There was a small ladder in the middle, lit by a greenish light. Bruno could make out what he believed was a human. It appeared to be making repairs or welding something together. There were also two other figures. They all were wearing gray tight-fitted suits and helmets obscuring their appearance. At this point, Bruno believed they were humans and yelled out if they needed help. He believed it could have been some type of experimental craft, possibly American. They muttered something back, though he couldn't understand. Bruno would later state they spoke in a guttural language, which he couldn't make out. Despite this, Bruno indicated he thought they tried to wave him inside the craft. Not only was their language weird, but they also moved awkwardly. At this point, he was able to see more strange aspects of the UFO. He then realized these figures weren't human. He suddenly became terrified, panicked, and started running away. At this point, one of the beings shot Bruno with a ray of light. The beam of light knocked him to the ground, and Bruno hit his head on a rock. As he laid there bleeding, he could see the ladder go up into the craft and the light coming through a door. The buzzing around intensified, and the craft took off into the sky. The following day, Bruno reported his encounter to the police. At the scene, there were things indicating something did happen the night before. Police found burn patches on the ground and indentation marks of something very heavy. Also, police discovered some weird, green pieces of a metal-like substance. Bruno believed this was from the welding, and that the green pieces of debris were leftovers of the process. The fragments were analyzed, and the results concluded that the fragments were an anti-friction material containing several types of metal along with a lubricant. One test revealed some sort of unknown metal. It was a yellow-white color, but was not any type of element found on Earth. A photo was taken after the event of Bruno with his clothes from that night. In the photo, the clothes appear to be blackened somewhat. Bruno received quite a bit of media attention after the incident and was interviewed multiple times after the event. It is said that Bruno's story has remained consistent over the years. Still, with many reports on the matter, it appears some details may have been lost in translation. For example, the outfit the beings are wearing is said in some reports as being more like a spacesuit than a dive suit. Also, some reports say that Bruno was at home, while others say he was nearby. His home was right next to the factory, and this could have been something misinterpreted somehow. Still, what can we make of this case? Bruno's case certainly seems realistic and has many elements we have seen in other UFO sightings and alien encounters. The one interesting detail to call out is the buzzing sound. This is a unique detail and something we've seen in other cases. On this channel, we covered at least 2 episodes where we saw this. This includes the Järve, Finland alien encounter and also the Udo Wartina incident. In addition to being a pretty credible witness, there was evidence at the scene. Police would find massive marks on the ground, and the results of the material discovered were inconclusive. In sum, this case appears to have some very credible aspects. The province of La Pampa in Argentina is located in the middle of the country, and much of the province falls in an area known as Las Pampas. Las Pampas are vast grasslands that extend 460,000 square miles throughout South America. The area is sparsely populated and heavily used by farmers and ranchers. In May 1950, an Argentinian businessman driving through the area would spot something he would never forget. In this episode, we will examine the case of Enrico Bassa and his encounter with a crashed UFO. Unlike other UFO crashes, this case is unique in that the extraterrestrials, not the government, appeared to cover up the wreckage. On May 15, 1950, 46-year-old Argentinian businessman Enrico Bassa was driving through the desolate grasslands of Las Pampas when suddenly he would see something strange up ahead. Around 300 meters ahead, Bassa, who was driving alone, spotted a silver object up ahead on the ground. As he got closer, a confused Bassa would drive slower and stop right where the object was. He spent a few minutes looking at it from inside his car. There was no one around it, and he wondered if it was a crashed airplane, but it looked like nothing he had ever seen before. The craft was oval-shaped, but had a dome that was transparent. It was silver and very shiny. Enrico noticed the sun was reflecting off it. He decided to step out of his vehicle and investigate. As he got closer, he made out more details. It was around 30 feet in diameter and 12 feet tall. The bottom was oval-shaped like an inverted saucer, and the top was shaped like a cylinder. On top of the cylinder, there was a small, dome-like structure. There were several portholes, or circular windows, similar to what ships have. The craft had crashed on an incline of about 20 degrees. Enrico spotted a door and decided to crawl up the hill and investigate. Enrico stuck his head in the craft, and it was very dim and smelled odd, like garlic. He decided to head in. The floor was only about 2 feet down from where the hatch was. As he hopped in, the floor shook, and Enrico believed he weighed too much for it. He glanced around the craft, and it was dark. After several minutes, Enrico's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he was able to make out more details around the craft. The inside of the craft was around 10 feet in diameter, and he saw portholes covered by some type of translucent material. Then Enrico spotted something frightening in the middle. There, someone or something was deceased. The being was around 3 to 4 feet tall, but oddly enough, seemed to strongly resemble a human. It wore a silver jumpsuit and had a round head which was resting downward on its chest. The face looked human though, similar to a teenage boy with a nose, mouth, and no facial hair. It had light brown skin and large eyes. The being was still tightly gripping the handles, presumably the controls to the ship, which came out of the black box. The chair it sat in was red, and next to the black box there appeared to be a disc, which resembled a TV not turned on. What Enrico saw next would truly frighten him though. On the sides of the craft, there were 2 low-lying sofas against the walls. On each one there was a being, identical in appearance to the first entity. Both were deceased, and terrifyingly, they had died with their mouths and eyes wide open. He would see another sofa, but it was empty. He realized that there was a 4th being that had escaped from the crash. It had opened the door to the ship. Enrico continued scanning around the craft and noticed a pulsating orange light coming from the ceiling. Somehow, it seemed to mesmerize him, and Enrico became overwhelmed with anxiety, quickly leaving the craft. Once he stepped outside, he noticed the air was much easier to breathe. He felt dizzy, and after some time tried to start his car, but it wouldn't start up. After some time it did, and he drove into the town of Girardeau. There, he would tell his friends the amazing story. His friends were skeptical, but after some convincing, Enrico was able to persuade them to go back to the crash site. There, as the men went to the spot, they saw a large pile of ash where the craft had been. The ash was still very warm. At that point, the men looked up in the sky and saw a craft identical to the one Enrico witnessed, hovering in the sky. It was quite high, being at least 1,000 feet off the ground. Above it, there was another craft just like it, and a bit higher up, there was another one. This one was much larger and cigar-shaped. The 2 smaller crafts would ascend. As this was occurring, the color of them changed from silver to red. They then entered the cigar-shaped object, and it quickly took off into the distance. The thought on what happened here follows. The being escaped from the downed craft and notified the large cigar ship, possibly the mothership. It came and picked up the remaining extraterrestrial and destroyed the damaged craft. There's generally 2 theories with this case. The first is that an extraterrestrial spacecraft somehow crashed. It's not uncommon for UFO crashes to occur, and there's evidence even with advanced technology this can occur. Just a few years earlier, the most famous UFO event in history occurred when a craft crashed in Roswell, New Mexico. Still, the appearance of the being raises questions from some and leads to the second theory. The second theory states that this was a hybrid, part human, part alien. The craft could have either been extraterrestrial or possibly part of a top-secret military experiment. This answers the question surrounding the being and its human-like characteristics. The 1940s and 50s was an exciting time in UFO culture, as many sightings were occurring, and even over populated areas. We saw events like the Battle of Los Angeles in 1942 and the Washington, D.C. UFO incident in 1952. This case does have one unique characteristic though. The crash was covered up by the aliens and not the government. On August 10, 1989, just outside the city of Prohladnyi, Russia, a strange, unidentified flying object was detected by military radar. The craft was thought to be an enemy aircraft heading toward Moscow and was immediately shot down by the military. After plunging into the mountains, the Soviet military approached it and soon came to realize that the object and the beings they would later find inside were not of this world. In this episode, we will explore this mysterious Russian UFO case. On August 10, 1989, Soviet soldiers would spot a strange object on radar flying around the city of Prohladnyi, Russia, in the southern part of the country. The Soviet military believed the UFO was a foreign adversary, such as the United States. As a result, all defense systems were put on high alert. The object was headed north and potentially toward Moscow or another large city. This led leaders to quickly believe the UFO was hostile. The Soviet leaders would then issue the order to shoot it out of the sky. As a missile was released, it tracked the object and directly hit it over the Caucasian mountain range located in southern Russia. To investigate the crash, an M18 helicopter was deployed and the military established a wide perimeter around it. The UFO had crashed outside Nizhya Shegem, and soon several additional teams arrived. The soldiers noticed the craft was around 20 feet long and 10 feet tall. It was oval shaped and the craft had landed on some rocks, and the military would detect radiation at the scene after some time. As a result, only soldiers who wore radiation suits were allowed to enter the scene. After an initial assessment, the object was airlifted by several military helicopters and dropped off at Mozdok Air Base. Security clearance was needed to enter the base as it held top-secret weapons like nuclear bombs. After the craft was dropped off, a special team was formed to investigate the object. It consisted of both military and non-military personnel. As they examined the UFO, on it, there was a partially open door that the team decided to go into. As they entered, the men encountered 3 aliens. 2 of the beings were killed in the crash, while a third laid severely wounded. A team was called in to try and help the being. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful and the being perished. On first visual inspection of the beings, they looked like typical gray aliens. They were light gray in color, short, around 3 to 4 feet, with large black eyes. However, as scientists started examining the body at a later time, it was discovered the outer portion was some sort of biological suit. As the gray skin was pulled back, the scientists were stunned to see a greenish-bluish color. The beings appeared to be reptilian in nature. After this event, the bodies of the 3 beings were put in a top-secret facility while the UFO was moved to another site. It is said the disk now resides at Kapustin Yar, a renowned Russian rocket complex. This report was compiled by a team of Russian UFO investigators, Anton Anvilov, Lenora Azizov, and Alexander Mosilov. While it's easy to dismiss the report as fraudulent, it's important to point out that in 1989 the Soviet Union was a highly centralized and controlled government. As a result, information was controlled, and the press was limited in what they could print. Many didn't speak up on events like this for fear of reprisal by the state. Once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, we began to see the press start to cover events more openly. It should be said, though, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected president. He advocated for freedom of the press. For example, in 1986, he introduced the policy of glasnost, or openness, in the media. However, this was still relatively new, and many in the press and those that had information were still not willing to speak out. Russia has a rich history of strange UFO cases, and these are just the ones we know about. For example, on January 29, 1986, in Dalnegorsk, Russia, a silent UFO, described as a reddish sphere, flew over the sky and crashed into a mountain. Dozens of people witnessed this strange event. Another incident is the Voronezh incident, which occurred in 1987. At 6:30 p.m., several boys playing soccer saw a pink glow in the sky. The ball circled the park they were in and then disappeared, reappearing a few minutes later to hover over the park. A crowd of people around the area saw the object and rushed to the site. Then, a hatch opened in the lower part of the object. Through the opening, people could see a three-eyed alien about 10 feet tall. The alien was wearing silver overalls and bronze-colored boots, along with a disc on its chest. What can we make of this case, though? Most of what happened in the story leaves little doubt around the events. We would expect the military to shoot down a UFO that invaded Soviet airspace, especially during this time. We would also expect that the military would overtake the area the UFO crashed in. In addition, it makes sense that they confiscated the UFO and took it to a military installation. Perhaps the strangest aspect of this case has to do with the aliens themselves. The beings appeared to be small grays, an alien type reported in a large number of UFO sightings and alien abductions. Many have speculated that the small grays are not biological in nature, but actually robots. They are often thought to be the foot soldiers in the alien hierarchy and disposable. The fact that the report says that some type of reptilian being were the aliens is surely a fascinating one. There are some who speculate on the presence of a reptilian race, but all too often, reptilians are dismissed as conspiracy. Based on the thousands of UFO reports we've read, we believe there are multiple alien races that have visited this planet. Being the biggest country in the world by area, it's clear that Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, has a treasure trove of UFO secrets hidden somewhere. It could be the case they have more than any other country in the world. Let's hope one day these cases are released into the general public. On January 29th at 7:55 p.m. in Dalnegorsk, Russia, a silent object, described as a reddish spear, flew over the sky and crashed into the Izvaka Mountain, or Hill 611. As the object passed over, dozens of Russians would witness the events and the strange way the object crashed. All witnesses reported that the object jerked, or jumped somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 times before eventually dropping like a rock. Then, the object burned intensely for about an hour. Still, as fascinating as this event was, perhaps what's more interesting is what happened after the event. 8 days after the UFO crash at Hill 611, on February 8, 1986, at 8:30 p.m., 2 more yellowish spheres came in from the north. Reaching the site of the crash, the UFOs circled the site 4 times before turning back to the north and flying away. Then, around a year and a half later, on November 28, 1987, at 11:24 p.m., 32 flying objects appeared from seemingly nowhere. There were hundreds of witnesses, including the military and civilians. These objects flew over 12 different cities and moved noiselessly at an altitude between 150 to 800 meters. Surprisingly, no eyewitness actually thought that they were UFOs. Those who saw the objects assumed they were aircraft involved in some disaster or falling meteorites. Yet, as the objects flew over the homes, they created television and radio interference. In the ensuing days after the initial January 29th crash, expeditions would form to investigate the wreckage. The first was Dr. Varese Prohladnyi, who arrived at the site 2 days after the crash. Since the crash occurred in the winter, deep snow was covering much of the area. But at the site of the crash, which was located on a rocky ledge, there was no snow. All around the site, there were smoky-looking pieces of a metal-like debris, with some sprayed-like in the form of solidified balls. At the edge of the site, a tree stump was found. It was burnt and emitting a chemical smell. The objects collected at the site were later dubbed as little balls or tiny nets. Closer examination of these revealed very strange and unusual properties that the elements were not from this earth. One of the tiny nets contained torn and very thin threads around 17 micrometers. Each of these tiny threads consisted of even thinner fibers which were intertwined. As Soviet scientists began to analyze the material, they realized it was extraordinary and not of this earth. To help better understand what they were dealing with, scientists melted the material inside a vacuum. Strangely, some pieces would spread over a base, much like butter being melted on a stove. However, other material would form into balls, and around half of the balls were covered with convex, glass-like structures. Interestingly, the tiny nets recovered were almost indestructible, with multiple tests being performed, such as submerging them in strong acids and organic solvents. Some have called the crash the Roswell incident of Russia. Like Roswell, there were a number of witnesses to the event, but the evidence doesn't appear to be publicly available. At Dalnegorsk, various evidence of alien remains were reported to be found, but never substantially proven. Furthermore, surrounding rocks had deposits of a silver metal, which was later determined to be common lead. The site itself has been reported to have high levels of electromagnetic activity, causing planes to avoid the area. Still, believers in the crash will point to the variety of eyewitnesses who saw the crash, albeit often with different reports. Dr. Zulini, a biologist by profession, went on to publish numerous articles on the event and dedicate his life to studying ufology. His conclusion was that it was a malfunctioning alien space probe that crashed into Hill 611. In the mid-1930s, much of the rural province of Sasketchwan in central Canada had not been modernized. Things such as telephones, paved roads, and electricity were non-existent. The town of Nipawin in Saskatchewan province is situated on the northwest corner of the area. During the summer of 1933, stories came out about into Nipawin that some residents, as well as a forest ranger, had been observing strange lights in the sky and near the ground. Whatever it was, they had been seeing it for the better part of a week. Some people believed that the strange lights were swamp gas from the nearby marsh in the northwest section of the province. Fortunately, not everyone in Nipawin was convinced that the lights were coming from the swamp gas. So on one night in 1933 during the summer, shortly after midnight, two men and a woman who wished to remain anonymous jumped into a small pickup truck and drove to the area where the lights were reported to have been seen. After some time driving, they would begin to see the glow on the horizon, and it gradually grew brighter as they drove on. After driving as far down the rough road would allow them, they got out and hiked through the woods in the direction of the glow. They were about a quarter of a mile or less from reaching the glow when they decided to stop and see what it was. From their vantage point, it had touched down in the swamp, and they were able to make out that the light came from a large, oval-shaped object that was domed at the top and slightly rounded on the bottom. It was supported by legs and had a hatch in the middle. Around a dozen figures could be seen going up and down a ladder-like stairway. The entities appeared to be slightly shorter than the average man, and were all dressed in what appeared to be silver-colored suits or uniforms. All appeared to be wearing helmets, and it seemed they were busy running around repairing the craft. Still, though, it was eerily quiet, even though the occupants were busy rushing around. Not a sound could be heard. The three witnesses stared and were completely nonplussed at what was going on. Frightened, none of the witnesses dared to speak out. The bright orange glow that came from the craft lit up the surrounding area. The light from the craft was not only bright, but was what could only be described as unearthly. It was something never seen by any of the witnesses before, and added to the mystery of the scene. After about a half hour, the three of them returned to the truck and started back to town, hoping to find a safe way around the swamp in which the UFO rested. When they finally did, they found a trail that might take them closer. They realized that they didn't have enough gasoline to go down the trail and to come back out. So, the three of them returned home for the night. A couple of nights later, they were able to go back out. It was clear and almost a full moon, and they hoped to get an even better view. But this night, the object was gone. No trace of the glowing craft could be seen from the vantage point of 2 nights earlier, and they returned to the truck to wait for dawn. Once dawn arrived, they walked back across the swamp to see if any evidence of what they had seen was left. And there was evidence indeed. 6 large square imprints that must have been the bases of the legs that supported the craft proved that there indeed had been something there that night. They were the same size, around 2 to 2.5 feet square, and approximately 9 to 10 feet apart, around 2 to 3 inches deep. It reminded the three of them of the kind of mark that would be made by a boiler plate stomped into the ground. They could also see markings where the base of the stairway met the ground. Remarkably, there was a great burn mark in the center of the area, approximately 12 feet in diameter. They looked for footprints, but found none. There appeared to be some scuffling of the vegetation surrounding the spot where the craft had been. They had came better prepared this time, though. One of the witnesses had brought a small brownie box camera and took photographs of the burn marks and of the imprints. Later, two of them wrote up an article about the whole affair and submitted it, along with copies of the photos, to a number of magazines and newspapers in Canada. However, no publication was interested, and those publishers that did reply wondered how much they had been drinking on those nights. In the course of the 40-plus years since the incident, the original photographs have been lost by the witness who took them, and who unfortunately learned the hard way that they were apparently of no interest to anyone. Perhaps copies of them are still in existence, stored in an attic or sandwiched between vacation shots in some photo albums. If they are ever uncovered, they may prove to be the earliest photographs of a physical trace case where there was witnesses of an unidentified flying object. On May 6, 1978, around 4:15 p.m., something crashed into a mountain near El Taller on the Bermejo River, around the border between the Bolivian province of Tarija and Argentina. Thousands of people saw this happen, and later described the object as being cylindrical in shape with a flaming tail. It was so loud and so fast, it caused a supersonic boom that was heard up to 150 miles away, and that cracked window panes as far as 30 miles in every direction. The next day, the papers were speculating on what had came down. The explanations ranged from meteorites to UFOs, or possibly a late re-entry of some Apollo capsule. As the questions were circulating, it was announced that the Argentinian authorities had sent the 20th unit of the border police to the area to question individuals and look for wreckage on their side of the mountain. The search in that mountainous country could last for weeks. At this time, swarms of reporters went to the nearest town, Aguas Blancas, to book rooms and await further developments. During this time, they began to interview eyewitnesses that saw the event in the town. As expected, there was a large number of witnesses who claimed to have seen the object. Most of them described it as oval or circular, and also metallic. The army, too, seemed to be convinced that it was a UFO. Corporal Natalio Fartan Ruiz, the commander of a small border police unit in the village of La Marmora, confirmed the crash to Argentinian reporters, saying it was about 4:30 p.m. when a cylindrical object made the earth tremble. Just imagine what would have happened if the UFO had fallen on the houses. Policeman Juan Hurtado had also seen what had happened. It looked like a gigantic white container emitting a trace of white smoke. I saw it clearly. It flew directly above my head. I was on duty, and at that moment was talking with 3 engineers from the mine in La Paz. The impact was so strong that it threw me to the ground. The earth trembled at that moment. After some debate, the Bolivian Air Force sent 3 single-motored AT-6 airplanes to the area and discovered the crash site on the southern slope of the El Taller mountain. Whereas the pilots found it impossible to land anywhere near it, the newspaper Clarín of Buenos Aires announced on May 14th that the object had been found. As proof, they quoted the police chief of Tarija. "Our men have discovered the object and inspected it, but have received no further instructions for further action. It is a dull, metallic cylinder 12 feet long with a few dents. No one knows what is inside, and we are awaiting the arrival of various technical commissions. A NASA expert is also expected to arrive tomorrow morning." But no NASA expert ever came to Tarija. Instead, 2 U.S. Air Force officers, Colonel Robert Simmons and Major John Heiss, arrived. Although these officers were officially on leave, they had been instructed to take the object to the United States in a Hercules C-130 transport machine, which was waiting for them in La Paz. When other newspapers made inquiries at the American Embassy regarding the secret mission of Simmons and Heiss, they were ignored. Only 2 years later, 5 documents were released by the U.S. State Department. They revealed that Simmons and Heiss had been assigned to the military attaché of the U.S. Embassy in La Paz and did, in fact, fly to Tarija. They were accompanied by an officer of the Bolivian Air Force in connection with Project Moondust. Project Moondust was a covert project by the United States Air Force during the Cold War that existed at the Air Force Missile Development Center at Holloman Air Force Base. The aim of the project was to recover objects and debris from spacecraft that had survived re-entry through the atmosphere back to Earth, and to exploit the discovery of Soviet hardware when it temporarily fell into American hands. Of the 5 documents recovered, none provided a clear picture of what had actually happened. And, regrettably, no further reports concerning the Simmons-Heiss expedition were released. To get a picture of what happened, ufologists and investigators were forced to rely on reports in the Argentinian press. Apparently, throughout the 5 reports, nobody had came to the conclusion that a meteorite had hit the Earth. One piece of solid evidence that it wasn't a meteorite comes from the Smithsonian Institution. At the world-famous Smithsonian Institution, there is a databank of scientific occurrences, an alarm network that keeps track of every volcanic eruption, every earthquake, and every meteorite collision since 1973 with painstaking accuracy. The databank reveals no mention of a meteorite falling during May 1978 around the Bolivian-Argentinian border. Still, communities around the crash site remain adamant that something did crash. There was also talk of men in black canvassing different areas, talking with eyewitnesses. Today, the 1978 Bolivian UFO sighting is remembered for several things. First was the abnormally loud sound and the sonic boom, which shattered windows and scared animals literally to death. Second was the large number of witnesses that saw the event. It's rare to get multiple witnesses sighting a UFO. but hundreds, and in this case thousands, is truly extraordinary. Many theories outside of it being a UFO or UAP exist. First, some believe that it was an advanced technology that the military was testing out. It is believed that the testing may have gone bad or there was some sort of malfunction. Skeptics believe that this was simply a high-speed military pilot that crashed. Perhaps people's memory was clouded by the loud sound, and there were suggestive ideas that caused mass hysteria. This could have led to an exaggeration of facts around the matter. Still, this doesn't explain the fact that the eyewitnesses were in thousands of different locations, and reports were generally similar. Due to the clandestine activities by the US military, notably military officers Simmons and Heiss, it's doubtful we will ever have more clarity around the events unless more documents are released or confessions are made. Many times, people forget that UFOs come in all sizes and shapes. Too often, it is assumed craft are mid to large size and are being operated by aliens a size comparable to human beings. In today's episode, we will examine a unique story from Japan. It is truly special in that it involves a craft just inches in size. UFOs descending on Earth in this size raise all sorts of fascinating questions, such as, are they merely probes? Would we even be able to see them up in the sky? As we will see though, something small can still be something extremely advanced. In late August 1972, just outside Koki City in Japan, Michio Seo, a 13-year-old, was on his way home from school when he spotted an incredible metallic object hovering over a rice field. The shocked Seo watched the odd craft zip back and forth, quickly changing directions at high speeds. The UFO was small, very small, being only about 8 inches wide and maybe 4 inches in height. The top of the UFO had a silver hat while the bottom was flat. Although he was somewhat afraid, he was fascinated by the object and began to approach it. However, before Seo could get too close, the UFO allegedly shot a blinding beam at him. Seo, not wanting to further provoke the UFO, ran away. Once Seo got back to Kera, he quickly rounded up 4 of his best friends: Hiroshi Mori, Yasuo Fujimoto, Katsuko Kojima, and a friend known only as Yuji. He told them about his incredible encounter. His friends were skeptical, although intrigued, and they decided to go out and find this tiny UFO. The friends went to the rice field and arrived at about 7 p.m. The boys waited about an hour or so, when finally, shocking everyone except Seo, the small object returned. The bewildered teens stared at the strange object that was hovering over the field approximately 60 feet away. As the sun set, it would begin to change colors, pulsating a multicolored light. One of the teens began to follow the floating UFO, and as he got close, the object suddenly emitted a deafening pop and began to shimmer blue. Scared, the teens took off home. The boys would occasionally visit the field following their sighting the next week. Then, on September 4th, they spotted it again. Around 9:30 p.m., the 5 young men once again spotted the object flying nearly 3 feet above the field. It started glowing and began to hover toward the teens, causing them to scatter and once again flee home. Once home, the boys decided to go back, but this time bring a camera. They were determined to get a photo, but that evening, the object did not return. Then, on September 6th, they spotted the object lying on the ground in the middle of the field before them. The teenagers wisely decided to snap a photo before they approached the resting craft. However, once the flash went off, the object began spinning and rapidly rose into the air. The boys were able to get another photo just after it lifted off. But that would not be for long, as the object retreated back to the dirt. The object was still spinning and seemed to be digging itself into the ground when it stopped moving. Then, 14-year-old Hiroshi Mori cautiously moved toward the flying saucer. Mori then decided to bend over and lift the object up with his bare hands. As he did so, strangely he claimed he felt something moving inside the object. A photo of Miro holding the UFO was then taken. The boys stared at the odd craft for some time before Miro wrapped it in a plastic bag, placed it in his backpack, and took it home. Once there, the boys measured the object and estimated it to be nearly 8 inches wide, almost 4 inches in height, and weighing about 3 pounds. There was no visible propulsion system. They also discovered a series of concentric curves, 31 small holes, and 3 unique designs carved into the base of the object. After looking at it more closely, the boys repacked the object in plastic and brought it to the home of Yasuo Fujimoto. Yasuo's father was the director of the Center for Science Education in the city of Koki. His father studied the object and carelessly said that the finding was of little significance. Later, though, that would be a decision he admittedly would come to regret. The boys then packed up the object, and mysteriously, it would disappear a day later. The next 2 weeks, multiple sightings would occur, and the group even managed to recover it again. However, like before, it seemingly disappeared into thin air. Somewhat frustrated after losing it again, the boys brainstormed what they could do to capture it again. After some time, the boys hypothesized that the object didn't like water and feared it. So, on September 19th, they once again returned to the field. This time the boys had a bucket of water and some rags. Luckily, they found the device sitting motionless on the ground. Quickly, the group covered the object with rags and poured the water from the bucket over it. They then turned the object over and started to fill the perforations at the base with the rest of the greenish water. Once the water entered into the craft, it began emitting a deafening noise, similar to a cicada, and the object also started to glow. The craft remained grounded, and the group took it once again. This time the group would study the craft more intensely. At Katsoko Kujima's house, they looked through the tiny holes and noticed what appeared to be miniature levers and weird drawings. They then took more photos and attempted to open the device by inserting a wire into one of the holes. Eventually, they were able to pull the top and bottom sections slightly apart and could see what they described as complicated electronic equipment. There was also some sort of liquid that some believe is the liquefied remains of the pilot. The object's shell was extremely tough, and the boys tried hammering it, and it didn't bend in the slightest or even scratch, even the thinnest parts. After several more experiments, the object was then given to Seo and Mori to watch. As they read their comic books, they were confident the object was safe with them. However, later that night, when everyone else returned, they were all upset to discover that beneath the pile of rags, there was nothing to be found. The boys had lost and found the object so many times by this point, they assumed that if it vanished, it would just turn up again near the field. Finally, the boys concocted a plan to put it in a plastic bag with water and take it into the city. After traveling on their bicycles, one of the boys holding the bag would feel a sharp tug, and then as the boys stopped, they realized it had disappeared yet once again. In 2007, a full 35 years after the events in question, Shiniko Namiki, the director of the Japan Space Phenomena Society, reopened the investigation into the story that had started getting attention in UFO circles in 2004. The head of the JSPS Osaka chapter, Kazuo Hayashi, was sent to speak with the remaining witnesses, and all confirmed the stories to be 100% accurate. With 5 witnesses to this event, and all remaining steadfast in their story, it seems completely plausible that these events occurred. Furthermore, honor is an important aspect of Japanese culture, so it seems unlikely that all 5 would agree to lie. That said, this story raises lots of questions surrounding tiny UFOs. While not perceived as really threatening at first, it could be possible these objects are probes that are sent to Earth to investigate and report back. If that's the case, the question is, to whom and what are they looking for? There's also the matter of these small objects being able to camouflage themselves easily. This may present more opportunities to gather information than having regular-sized ships. Still, all of this is conjecture, as we can only speculate what this intelligence may want and what our governments know about them right now. World War I, like many other wars, was renowned for its harsh conditions. Extremely brutal, soldiers on the front would spend years fighting trench warfare to possibly only gain a few hundred yards of ground. The conditions were especially dangerous as these trenches were filled with rats, corpses, and disease. Despite all this, military propaganda needed heroes and individuals that would keep spirits up during the war. In Germany, one such figure was Baron Manfred von Richthofen, or perhaps better known today as the Red Baron. The Red Baron was one of the most skilled and dangerous fighter pilots of World War I and possibly all time. Loved by his country and respected by his enemies, the Red Baron would shoot down at least 80 planes during his military career. In April 1918, he would be fatally wounded in a mission around 6 months before the end of the war. His death is somewhat controversial, as some say Canadian pilot Arthur Roy Brown shot the plane down, while others say it was anti-machine gun fire. Despite this, many legends surround the Red Baron and his war heroics. One legend, though, concerns something unique. According to German Air Force ace Peter Weitzrich, he watched the Red Baron shoot down a UFO with orange lights over Belgium in 1917. Weitzrich claims that on an early morning mission in western Belgium, a strange craft appeared in the clear blue sky. He and the Red Baron were terrified because they had never seen anything like it. The ace pilot then opened fire and directly hit the UFO. Weitzrich claims that after being hit, the UFO crashed in the nearby woods and 2 bald-headed aliens jumped out of the craft and disappeared into the woods. After Weitzrich and the Red Baron returned to base, they reported the incident but were told to keep quiet and never mention it again. It's been stated by alien hunter Scott Waring that the Red Baron most likely hit the antenna and that fatally damaged the craft. Throughout history, war has produced more sophisticated and deadly technology. The American Civil War saw the beginning of landmines. World War I introduced machine guns and airplanes, among other things. World War II saw the beginning of radar and nuclear weapons. In the spring of 1917, when the craft was allegedly shot down, the United States had recently entered the war. Both the Baron and Watrix were aware that the enemy might have a new type of craft. As such, to this day, no one uses circular aircraft with no visible propulsion systems. After the story came out from Watrix, skeptics immediately pointed out the story must be fraudulent. Watrix waited until 1997 to tell the story publicly, and before then only told his daughter and his wife. Also, some skeptics point out that with advanced alien technology, there's simply no way a plane from back then could surprise a craft and that a machine gun could damage it. Still, many say that this story has some legitimate aspects to it. For one, why did this 105-year-old man decide to come out and tell his story? There doesn't appear to be any sort of thing he gained by telling it. It seems more likely that this was the case of someone wanting to get something off their chest before they passed away. Also, it seems plausible as well that he kept the secret for years, as he would have been the only one to confirm the story, since the Red Baron was dead. Also, there was quite a negative stigma on people claiming to see flying saucers back then. We can imagine that Watrix wanted to protect his family and might not have wanted to put them at risk. Finally, as for the argument that machine guns couldn't hurt a UFO, it's probable that this craft was caught off guard. We also know that UFOs do crash, as we've seen this with quite a few cases. While we will probably never know if this crash occurred, perhaps somewhere in Germany, there is a file cabinet with a record of this report. Perhaps one day, Germany and other countries alike will release cases like this. Over the years, many sightings of UFOs have been reported. There's even a considerable amount of alien encounters and alien abduction cases that have been reported and studied. However, rarely do reports come in where individuals collide with these unknown objects. Today's story is truly remarkable in that there exists various physical evidence. As reported by the CSX engineer on board that train that day, on January 14th, 2002, at 2:47 a.m., a coal train in transit from Russell, Kentucky to Shelbyana, Kentucky, collided with an unknown hovering object. The object was described as 10 feet high and about 20 feet in length. It was a metallic-looking disc with multiple colored lights near the bottom and in the middle. There were no windows or openings of any kind. As the engineer described it, both the trailing unit and the first two cars were severely damaged. He knew it was 2:47 because his watch froze, and to this day, the watch shows that time. Along with his watch, the entire electrical systems on both locomotives went haywire. Approaching a bend near milepost 42, in an area referred to as the Wild Kingdom for the many different types of animals spotted there, the conductor and the engineer saw lights coming from around the way. Ordinarily, this means another train is coming and will soon pass on the other track. As the engineer killed the lights as to not blind the oncoming crew, they rounded the corner and their onboard computer began to flash in and out. The speed recorder went nuts, and both locomotives died. Alarm bells began to ring, and then that's when the engineer and the conductor saw the objects. Apparently, they were scanning the river for something. At least 3 objects had several searchlights trained there. The first object hovered about 10 to 12 feet above the track. It was metallic silver in color. There were no windows or openings, and it was about 18 to 20 feet in length and probably 10 feet high. With both engines dead, as they rounded the corner, they made little noise, and the first object did not respond in time. The engineer estimated that they hit the object at 30 miles per hour, with 16,000 trailing tons behind them. It clipped the top of their lead unit and then skipped back, slicing a chunk out of the trailing unit and the first 2 coal cars. At this point, the other objects vanished. The emergency brakes then initiated due to the loss of power, and they stopped approximately 1.5 miles to 2 miles after impact. The power restored after they were stopped, and the men notified their dispatcher, located in Jacksonville, Florida, of what had happened. They were told to inspect the cars to see if they'd hold the rail and try to limp into milepost 60, which used to be the Paintsville yard, which is no longer in full service. As they checked everything, the cab of the rear locomotive was demolished and smoking. The second 2 cars looked as they had been hit with a giant hammer, but they looked like they'd hold the rail. As the men pulled into Paintsville Yard at approximately 5:15 a.m., the huge overhead lights lining the yard were noticeably dark, and the only lights came from what they assumed were railroad officials parked near the end of the track. They pulled to a stop and began unloading the grips off the wounded train. Then, they could hear what sounded like an army of workers immediately tending to the train. Vehicle doors slamming, guys running by in weird outfits, and lights glaring from all directions. The one thing missing from this picture was the railroad officials. A guy named Ferguson shook the engineer's hand and asked him to follow into the old yard office. As they did, once inside, the men were clueless who was questioning them. As hundreds of questions were being asked, they told the men, for their own protection, they'd be medically tested before they could leave. The engineer asked repeatedly to talk to his road foreman or train master, and not only were these requests denied, but they confiscated the conductor's cellular phone. Hours later, they were led outside the old yard office, and strange things continued to happen. The 2 locomotives and 2 cars were removed from the rest of the train. Parked 4 tracks over under a huge tent, it was buzzing with activity. The men didn't see too much around this, but were led off the property and told, due to national security, their silence on this matter would be appreciated. They were put in a railroad vehicle and taken to Martin, Kentucky, where they went through questioning again with railroad officials and were then drug tested. After all of this, they were sent on to Shelbyana, where they rested for about 8 hours and worked another train back to Russell. Working back, the men passed by Paintsville with no sign of the engines, cars, tent, people. It's as if nothing had ever happened. As the story has circulated the internet, there have been many that claimed that this never happened. For one, there doesn't appear to be any additional eyewitnesses and no reports of strange activity from locals on that night. Also, many point out it seems unlikely that a UFO, with the advanced technology it possesses, would collide with a train. Still, others are not so sure. The most famous UFO incident in modern history was a UFO crash at Roswell, New Mexico, so there is a precedent for these crafts crashing. Also, if the witness had lied about the story, then why would he do so? The engineer, if he didn't provide his name or information, wouldn't be able to benefit either financially or through the press. This story was reported to MUFON, and it seems to me the person might just be looking for answers to what happened that night.